Hi, this is Dr. Nadine Rosechild Sullivan, and I want to welcome you to Social Stratification for summer 2021. And I want to take a moment just to, I like to be grounded in where we are in space and time, what's going on around us, what's going on in the political sphere. And so given that, and given the fact that we're talking about social stratification, this is a sociology course in social stratification. It's important to recognize that race is one of the components by which we are socially stratified. We're stratified by class, by socioeconomic class status in the United States. We are stratified by gender and sexuality at a number of levels. We're also stratified by race, ethnicity, native-born versus foreign-born status, documented versus undocumented immigrant status. All of those factors are a part of this component that we class, or these components that we class or that we categorize as race and class and gender. Saying that, there is currently a political discussion about something that is being titled critical race theory. Now, there is a critical race theory, but the use of it, the way it's being referred to in some venues, some public spaces, is not actually what critical race theory is. And it's just important for a moment for you to understand, where you're at, what's going on. You are at Rowan University. Rowan University has a division of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Rowan University also has a graduate program in diversity and inclusion, of which I am presently coordinator, and for which I teach the Introduction to Diversity and Inclusion class each fall. Rowan is a place that has a statement about being affirming in regard to diversity and inclusion. And we are working very, very hard to diversify our student body, to diversify our faculty, and to retain students from a wide variety of backgrounds and faculty from a wide variety of backgrounds. And just to put that out there, right? To be part of this world. This is our world, right? We are a world filled with people in different get put into different categories. And so let's just back the train up for a moment, right? Race is a social construct. It is an absolutely established fact of many disciplines in academia that race is a social construct, that beneath the biology of our facial features, there is no biology to race, right? So there is phenotype, hair color, hair texture, eye color, shape of, nose or brow or chin. Those things get us put into, get us seen as within a certain race, get us treated with the other, certainly skin color, but get us put into various categories. Now, the social construct of race, while there's nothing biological to it, we're not different in our bones, we're not different in our blood, we're not different in, even though there are a couple of diseases that genetically run through into various people groups, they're actually coming through lines of inheritance of family trees, not race categories. So race is very real in our lived experience. The social construction of race affects our everyday lived experience. There are aspects that are culture based on where we're from, and there are components of food and religion and self-expression and music and taste that all go with cultures. But race, biologically, if you can't, there's no test, there's no difference in in any of that. Even when we're looking at the DNA studies or the Ancestry.com kind of spaces, the 23andMe kinds of spaces, what they're telling us about is our family trees, our very extensive family trees, but they're not actually telling us about race. They're telling us that I've got family lines that come through these regions of the world. So this public noise at present about critical race theory. Critical race theory is actually an academic discipline or an academic study within law, within legal studies, that looks at how race and law have been have gone together in mostly United States history or in global colonialism, but we're pretty Americentric in the United States, and most of our academic disciplines focus a lot on U.S. studies. But that space of law and race or ethnicity or perceived race and ethnicity coming together, and how that then affects us, right? How that has affected us historically, the history of that, how it's played out across centuries and decades, and how it affects us still. I want to take a moment to read a couple of definitions. So I am reading from an article by Ryan Cooper from the 14th of May, 2021, in something called The Week. And he quotes Richard Delgado and Jean Stefanik. I guess I said her name right. So as they said in their book, Critical Race Theory, an introduction, critical race theory is an academic movement originating in studies of racism and the law. In general, such scholars argue that racism is common and structures everyday life, that it tends to benefit both rich and poor whites, though I would add differently, okay, because class matters too, but that that racism does benefit even poor whites as well as rich whites, and that race is a social construct instead of some biological fact. This is established, and that racism is highly varied and expressed in ever-shifting forms, and that people of color generally have a special knowledge of their own oppression. Right. So one of the factors is that as a person assigned, seen as white, growing up in a white culture, or growing up with, white parents of European background, as coming out of a family of European descent and growing up in a neighborhood that was really segregated in my youth, I was not aware of myself as a white person. I was not aware of that until well into my teens. In fact, in my childhood, come from a Catholic family and went to Catholic school. And to me, there were two kinds of people in the world, Catholics and publics. The kids who went to Catholic school with me and the kids who walked down the street, not wearing a uniform, oddly enough, wearing really daily regular clothes and walking to public school. I was a little jealous of their having changes of outfits, but so just not aware of that. Whereas if I had been born a child of color, it's highly, highly likely that I would have recognized that racial distinctions much, much earlier, even in a segregated setting, and experienced microaggressions even as a child based on that. So microaggressions being small, not that they're not to minimize them, but macro is like the big picture, everything, and micro is more individual. So not small, individual. More broadly, critical race theorists often interrogate the underlying structures and biases of legal systems and arguments. So there's that's not how it's being presented in certain venues, right? It's being argued that critical race theory is teaching that, every white person is an oppressor. Critical race theory is teaching that, they're saying that critical race theory is teaching that everybody, all this racism, right? And that it's actually making racism bigger, to have conversations about it, or to ground it in history, or to look at the laws that have encoded it and kept it going, right? That have created a system that is a self-perpetuating system that keeps races in different spaces in the United States as far as advancement goes, or being together. So anyway, at this time, as far as I can tell tonight from my Googling, there are about 12 states that are pressing forward laws to outlaw the teaching of the history of racism and race in America. It's actually to outlaw the teaching of race, right? It's not to outlaw critical race theories and something that's happening in the college level. It's not happening K through 12. But so these laws are meant to outlaw honest conversations in grade school, middle school, and high school classrooms, honest teaching of where we've been, our good and our bad. And that's something. Also at the national level, This article by Ryan Cooper made the statement, at the national level, 30 congressional Republicans have co-sponsored 2 bills, the Combating Racist Training in the Military Act. They like to reframe the combating racism, but combating racist training, right? So they're actually trying to combat the teaching that white people in any way ever oppressed people of color. But Combating Racist Training in the Military Act and the Stop the Critical Race Theory Act, which would basically prohibit anti-racism or diversity training for federal employees or members of the military. The former guy had done that in last September, and in September 20, I think it was September 22nd, 2020, there was an executive order that forbid diversity and inclusion training or in any kind of federal space, including the military. And then it expanded it to, first it was a memo and then it was an executive order. It expanded it to all institutions taking federal money. That was struck down. So of course, universities take federal money, right? They take your federal student loan dollars. And so that was struck down by another executive order. So it was an executive order. It was supplanted by the current president's executive order within 24 hours of his arrival after inauguration into the workspace. And so it is legal again. It was not legal, sort of. It wasn't a law, but there was an executive order that institutions were going to be being called on the carpet about receiving federal dollars if they allowed me to teach diversity and inclusion, either to my graduate students or to my undergraduate students. And so that was true from September 22nd till January 20th or 21st, and that was struck down. So now this is an attempt to come back again. It's 30 congressional Republicans. It's not going to get through at this point in time, but they're trying to put that back in play. I want to make another point. Okay, so Kimberly Crenshaw, this is a quote from Professor Kimberly Crenshaw, and she is a critical race scholar. And she has said, you can never forget. So she says that critical race theory is an academic discipline that seeks to understand how racism, and I would add white supremacy, have shaped US laws and how those laws have continued to impact the lives of non-white people. It's a study in academia based on the concepts of systemic and institutional racism. And we can never forget that slavery was perfectly and legal and constitutionally protected in the US, right? That law has played a mixed role in our history. It has, she's speaking as an African-American woman, says it has enslaved us. It has justified disenfranchising us. It has justified segregating us. It has justified marginalizing us and criminalizing us. Systemic racism refers to how the government has, and this might not be her, this might be an article writer, Kiera Alfonseca. Systemic racism refers to how the government has discriminated against Black, Indigenous, and other people of color through unjust policies concerning housing, employment, criminal justice, education, and more. I have some videos I'll be sending you that deal with some of those factors as we move forward. But summing it up, we have tremendously wonderful founding documents in the sense that our founding documents, being the Declaration of Independence and the US Constitution, called for, whatever their perfections or flaws, they called for a vision of all of us being created equal, of all of us having a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? They called for this image of justice and fairness. They were coming and they were getting rid of the idea of monarchy and rid of the idea of an authoritarian dictatorial government or head of government, and moving to the idea that we could govern ourselves, the idea of democracy, of a representative democracy, a republic, but this concept of the republic and democratically ruled, right? The people, by the people, of the people, by the people, for the people, government. Those are documents to which American citizens have been rising up and demanding inclusion across our 200 plus years. So from the writing of those documents, our history begins before that. Our history includes more than 17,000 years of indigenous peoples inhabiting the landmass that we now know as the United States, also Canada, Mexico, Central and South America. So the Americas were inhabited by indigenous peoples, millions and millions of them, perhaps 100 million of them, depending on our best, sociological, statistical inferences. But so there were literally 100 million or nearly 100 million people in the Americas. This was not an empty continent. Europeans came here, and they came in three primary groups: the English, the French, and the Spanish. They came into different parts of this North, Central, and South America. It was not called America then, but they came to this place and they began a process of subjugation of the people that were here. They spoke about the continent in their writings, and we are often taught in grade school like it was kind of this empty wilderness. It was not an empty wilderness. It was a teeming with people wilderness, and or I go with the wilderness concept in the fact that it was natural. There was a respect for the environment. There wasn't a lot of changing of the environment. There was some farming and there was some city building, but there was not, and good city building in pyramids, depending on where you're at. But still, it was a space in which the indigenous peoples respected the land. And so it was lovely. The eastern woodlands were just many, many more trees than we currently have, than we have today. So here's this space, right? In come Europeans of these various types, and we end up, you and I, we end up under this structure of government that gets created by the Europeans from England here on the East Coast that becomes the United States. But prior to that, with the first wave of Europeans, the first attempt is to enslave the indigenous population. Many are enslaved. There's a history of the enslavement of indigenous or Native Americans. There's a disease factor because they were not immune to the smallpox that Europeans were bringing with them, and had not been exposed to the long story, but had not been exposed to those pandemics before. And so many die from disease, many die at the sword. And so there's a great reduction in their population. And so then the white people, they were white Europeans. They didn't necessarily think of themselves as white at that time. It's a concept that it's an identity that comes later, but they are who we identify as white. They begin to capture and transport and enslave Africans, bringing them into the Americas, into many parts of the Americas, into the East Coast, over the Middle Passage, and into the island nations, and use the Africans who did have some resistance to smallpox because they had farm animals across millennia, and brought them and enslaved them. So the history of what is now the United States actually begins with this genocide against indigenous peoples, and some of it is quite intentional, and begins with this enslavement of Africans as transportation and enslavement, and holding in bondage of Africans in America. And so there is that. There's also enslavement that goes to people we now call Latinx. So Mexicans in the Southwest, what's now the southwestern part of the United States, was northern Mexico, and there's enslavement there. There's lynching that happens in these spaces. A history of lynching both of African Americans and of Latinx peoples, specifically in the Southwest. There are, later migrations of the Chinese and racist laws that are passed against Asians as they come in from various home countries as they come into the United States as well. Some of the first anti-interracial marriage laws were passed out west and against those who were of Asian origin, not marrying white women, right? And you get that very early also in places like Virginia. And so there's this history. Before the United States becomes the United States, much of this is already transpiring. And then in this space, this structure gets made, the Independence Hall and the Liberty Bell and, the Declaration of Independence, and then the War of George Washington, the Revolutionary War. And then there's this structure. And in this structure, because of these visionary words, whatever Thomas Jefferson and whomever helped also write those documents, whoever they were as individual human beings and whatever their flaws, the words were lilting, and they caused people group after people group to press in. So there began to be a labor movement and a women's rights movement, labor movement, and then an abolitionist movement to abolish slavery, and then a women's rights movement. And we just go on and on and on, so that we've come through a whole litany of movements for social justice that have included, various waves of women's rights and LGBTQ rights, and just all of our social justice movements arising out of this soil of these words that said all of us are created equal. And to the point where Elizabeth Cady Stanton at the Seneca Falls in 1848 in the Declaration of Sentiments based it on the Declaration of Independence, as women began to call for their rights, began to meet and regularly call for their rights and their inclusion. And so there's this whole history of things. We leave the Civil War to go into all pretty quickly. There's a brief window of Reconstruction, and then there's this reinstitution of a new form, not of outright enslavement, but of almost outright enslavement of African Americans, so that we end up with de jure and de facto segregation. So we end up with, in the southern states of the historic Confederacy, we end up with de jure segregation, where the law, right, of the law says that they must be separated, must be segregated, cannot occupy these positions. In the North, in places like Pennsylvania and New Jersey, the segregation is still every bit as real, but it's de facto. It's in fact, not in law. It's not inscribed in law after the Civil War, but it is inscribed continuously in the social norms and in reality. You knew where you could go and where you couldn't go, and what you could do and what you couldn't do, and never the twain shall meet except in matters of servitude, right? So if I'm Black, I'm living in a certain space, I'm allowed to travel into the white neighborhood to serve, to mow lawns, and to clean houses, and raise children, but I must go back to my other neighborhood for my own home, right? So this segregation that's very, very real, and it becomes inscribed in other things. I talk at length elsewhere about how it becomes inscribed in in not including African Americans and in the early Social Security regulations, or in how African Americans are excluded from labor unions early on, or how, and I mean early on into the mid 20th century, into about the time I was born, and how there's just this ongoing segregation that's enforced in housing. It's there in FHA and VHA housing loans. It's there in in federal policy, in local policy, state and regional and city policies, county policies. And there's also this long history that I won't go into here of police brutality against African Americans and Latinx people. And with that as well, there's a history at the end of slavery. There's a period of decades long where African Americans are arrested on bogus charges, so they could be imprisoned and forced to work for, again, next to nothing or nothing as prisoners, and an ongoing history today of the use of those who are imprisoned in the United States on sometimes charges like doing a little weed. And so just this long history, this has been ongoing, this history of peonage. And so something to be talked about at another time. But all of these things, and right down to our current, we've been living the last 14, 15 months through a pandemic. And we've been living, through it here in our region of the United States, in New Jersey and Philadelphia. And many of my students, my Rowan students, as we first went out on, as we first went home on lockdown in March of 2020, many of you are connected to North Jersey. Many were connected to North Jersey. We've seen lots of suffering, lots of sickness, lots of death in our part of the country. In that first part of the first wave of this pandemic, we're still going through it. There are new variants, and there's still, and younger people are those who are getting sick. So, but there have been disparate COVID effects and outcomes as well, so that there's been real differences in sickness rates and death rates among communities of color versus communities that are white, not meaning that COVID wasn't discriminating. The virus doesn't care. We're equally human in physicality and equally subject because of that. The difference is access to healthcare. The difference is the necessity of working outside the home, the ability to work virtually or not work, the inability to work virtually. So a lot of those factors have played into these disparate COVID outcomes for people of different racial categories, right? Since race is a social construction, but it affects our lives in very real way and our deaths in very real ways. There's talk in critical race theory, and there's talk in the academy and talk in this class about white privilege. There should also be more talk about Black and people of color disprivilege. And so white privilege is simply the statement that if you are white, you are not judged or mistreated for the color of your skin by anyone, generally speaking, in a position of power, which is not to say that you never walked in, if you're white, that you never walked into a retail store and had a cashier take the Black person next to you instead of you, even though you were first in line. I'm not talking about nobody's ever given you side eye. What we're talking about is that in real ways, so racism is a system that marries prejudice with power. Okay, so we break it apart in the race literature. We break it apart. There's individual bigotry or prejudice. Beverly Daniel Tatum, in her book Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria, talks about how it's prejudice is the smog in the air we breathe. If you actually go back, it's in the old Bugs Bunny cartoons. It's in all it's in the cartoons you grew up in. It's in all of the media. It's in representations. It's in modern day television. It's in modern day movies. There's this constant differentiation, this constant, even today, in today's movies, most of the time a person of color is sort of a side character, or just part of the backdrop of, you may see, like all white people in the front and all white people as the protagonist of the plot of the script, but somewhere in the back, one or two people of color walk across, and just the extras in the movie film, but not, we're not centered on real equity and inclusion in most of our media representations to this time, right? So there's this smog in the air we breathe. If you take young children and you talk to them in grade school about Thanksgiving, they're going to draw racist pictures of Native Americans because we've taught them this, right? This is not, we're still having a war over over whether or not we should change the names of sports teams that use slur words against that are slurs against Native Americans, right? This is ongoing, and certainly the experiences of people within various groups. There's been a lot of anti-immigrant language the past couple of, the past administration. There's been a lot, and coming up to it, there's been a lot of raising of fervor. Thankfully, we just passed a hate crimes legislation in regard to Asian Americans. But this, using this, there's been a racist rhetoric around this pandemic, right? And so all of these things are there in the general space. So there's prejudice and bigotry. But racism is when you put that with power. So if I am in a position of power, and it's been mostly white people in positions of power and remain so, if I'm in a position of power and I hold these prejudices, I have these, I've internalized these bigotries. Maybe I know it, maybe I don't. Maybe I mean badly, or maybe I don't have a nefarious thought or feeling in my head. Maybe I actually think that I don't have any racist feelings, and maybe I don't, but, or maybe I do, and they're unexamined. But there's this combination. So in institutions, institutional racism is systemic. It's built into the system, and it's been there so long. It doesn't take a person in power to have bigotry to create an act of discrimination. So prejudice and bigotry are one thing, and discrimination is an act, right, or a barrier. And then when you put together power, the power of somebody to do, the power of a gatekeeper who can decide something, and they're bigoted, right? If I am the employer and I have just internalized stereotypes, I've been taught these stereotypes. I may think they're real. I may think that this people group is louder, or that one's more hardworking, or this one's better at math, or that one's lazier, whatever those stereotypes are, right? They're not true of individuals within any of our groups. But if I hold those and I hold the gate, I'm the one who gets to decide who to hire or not hire. Then, I may see names that look Asian or Latinx or African American, and just kind of push those resumes to the side and go over here with Sarah Jones, right? Go over here with a name that looks white, or go over here, if I've internalized some sexism, I might go over here with Mark Jones instead of Sarah, whatever that is. And so in that space, that's this marriage of prejudice and power. And that is the outworking of racism systemically within institutions in our society. And it is ongoing. It has come down to us. We've inherited a legacy, and it's still present today. And no one in the race theory or race literature, no race scholar in the United States. And I did do a graduate concentration in race and ethnicity, requiring me to read broadly in the race literature. And I didn't do it that long ago, and I keep abreast. So in the race literature, nobody is blaming you. Nobody is saying that those of us born after these things were happening, right? No one's blaming me for the Middle Passage. No one's blaming me, Dr. Sullivan, for what happened in 1850 or 1860. No one's blaming me for what happened in 1619. No one's, but on the other hand, what we are saying in any level of race scholars, what we are saying is we're here now, and there's problems today. Let's fix them. Like, I'm not responsible for what my ancestors did or didn't do. And I could sit here and have a conversation about, well, most of my ancestors weren't in the country yet. Maybe somewhere, maybe most weren't, right? Most of them were over in Ireland or whatever, Europe somewhere, coming after World War I or coming just before World War I. So most of my people weren't here, but that's not the point, right? The point is I'm here now. And so there were white people here then, and they were being overtly racist and discriminatory, and they held an ideology of white supremacy. And we have seen people today holding an ideology of white supremacy. That doesn't mean that you hold an ideology of white supremacy. That doesn't mean that you believe that white people are inherently smarter or better cultured or this or that, whatever, whatever the thing is that doesn't mean you believe white people are superior or that Black people are superior. It doesn't believe that you or I or any of us in this class or any of us at Rowan University, nobody's saying that any individual among us believes in white supremacy or holds that kind of racist ideology or even holds any negative feelings. And we may all have friends across people groups. Hopefully we do, like really, truly actual friendships and more than one. But because that's what we need to know each other and just see our shared humanity. No one's saying that, but what we are saying in critical race scholarship is that those of us here now, owe it to each other and to our descendants down through the generations, assuming global climate change allows there to be future generations for a long time to come. We owe it to our ancestors and our descendants, whomever our ancestors were, even if they were white supremacists, we owe it to all of the human race to fight this thing, to change this thing, wherever we are, in whatever sphere we're in. So if I come to a position of power where I'm hiring people, choosing who to hire or not, I go deal with myself and I bring all of the resumes together and I look at them honestly. Maybe I make sure that the names are blocked so I can't try to assign sex or race to those resumes. And I really look and I really call for the interviews with the people whose qualifications are there. You know, maybe that's what it means. Maybe it means that places like Rowan University put in an Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion and institute graduate study in diversity and inclusion. Maybe it means that we take sociology classes in race and in critical race theory. Sociology of minority groups is a fabulous class as well to deal with these issues. And then the gender classes I teach, you know, fabulous to deal with the you know, roots of sexism, which go deep as well and are of longstanding and continue with us today in ways that harm you and me. So basically, there's a lot of noise about critical race theory. There's a lot of accusations. I do want to also add that it is not Democrats that teach critical race theory. It is not a platform of the Democratic Party. All teachers teaching the literature on race and racism and the history in the United States are not Democrats. All of your professors are not Democrats. Some are Republicans, some are independents, and some race scholars are also Republicans or independents. And so, you know, just saying, this is not about liberal versus conservative. This is not about one party versus another, even though that's how it's being spun. The truth is that there are facts, not alternative facts. There are real facts of real history, and they are well documented. And there is a library swallowed up by my own books right now. And you know, I only buy Amazon used, right? But I mean, there's a wealth of race scholarship and historical scholarship and gender scholarship. There's a wealth of real, honest history to be looked into all over our region. Remnant spaces. I just read the article this morning about another site that got designated as an official Underground Railroad site near me. And so, you know, the history of South Jersey in regard to the Underground Railroad, well worth understanding, well worth looking into. The history of, you know, Philadelphia in that regard, right? And the another really important fact to point out is that there is also a long history of white allies. So in the fight against racism, in the fight against oppression and discrimination and harm on the grounds of race, there is a long history of white people, not enough of us, but some of us who really truly put our lives and our sacred honor and our livelihoods and perhaps our finances on the line, but our lives. You know, there are people who lost their lives, who were white, who lost their lives both in fighting in the fight to abolish slavery, and in the civil rights movement, and now in you know, and this is not. I don't have space or time. I've talked too long already to go deeply into the Black Lives Matter movement right now, but there are real grievances that the Black Lives Matter movement is asking to be redressed, to be addressed. They're asking for a redress of these grievances. They're asking for them to stop. They're asking for change. And it's we have a crying need for this change. And there are white allies in that movement. Approximately a year ago, with the public lynching of George Floyd by now convicted Derek Chauvin, by a police officer who has indeed been found guilty of murdering him. That was a public lynching. It was extrajudicial. The definition of a lynching is when a vigilante violence of a mob or when state violence of duly authorized people like police officers enforce a death penalty on someone who has not been tried and found guilty, and they're not the appropriate party to be the designated executioner of the state to be performing this. It was a public lynching, and we all have seen that footage. And we took to the streets in the middle of a pandemic, masked as best we could, literally by the hundreds of thousands, by the millions, and by the millions globally to protest that murder. But his is a daily, no, I haven't looked at the stats to say daily, but it's a definitively frequent occurrence in the United States. The murder of an African-American person, sometimes mostly males, sometimes females, sometimes the extreme harassment and terrorizing of children, sometimes the murder of children, sometimes because they happen to be in the back seat and the car is being shot with 50 bullets and the kid gets killed too, right? But this is an ongoing situation in which people who have not been tried and convicted of any crime are being executed by police officers, unarmed victims, setting completely aside anyone who actually has a weapon. A cell phone is not a weapon. If I pick up my cell phone, I am not picking up a weapon. But if I pick up if you ask for my driver's license and I pick up my wallet, I'm not picking up a gun, right? But there have been those cases, and these cases are ongoing, and they have a long history. We've just begun the cell phone taping of them the past decade, with the murder of Oscar Grant in Fruitvale Station in San Francisco, 2000. I think it was New Year's Day, 2009. Just after a little bit after midnight. But don't hold me to that year. But the murder of Oscar Grant was caught on numerous cell phone cameras at all sorts of angles, because he was executed on a subway platform, as people they'd taken the subway. He had taken the subway so he wouldn't be driving drunk, because it was New Year's Eve. But the cell phone footage has brought it more and more and more to our awareness. So this is ongoing. Also, there's been like old women who have been stabbed waiting for a bus, like within the last couple of weeks, because they were Asian, right? And there's this, so just on and on and on. But there's this long history of police violence. So it was not a police officer, to my knowledge, that stabbed those women waiting at a bus, or waiting for a bus. But this long history has got to be stopped, has got to be changed. Police officers have a right to be safe, but they also don't have a right to just execute people who have a broken taillight or whatever. So I am going to be ending this now with saying that I rejoice in the COVID-19 Hate Crimes Act passage and being signed into law. I also rejoiced in the James Byrd Jr., Matthew Shepard Hate Crimes Act that President Obama signed into law a few years back. And also, want you to recognize that as you are listening to whatever the noise is abroad about critical race theory, it is actually an academic discipline. That the actual critical race theory is looking at how law and racist ideologies have come together to create the structures that we have known across our history and that we are living with today. That all we are saying is that all of us need to be allies if we are, the person who's in the people group is the activist, and the person who's out of the group but is on the side in the struggle is the ally. And so we all need to be allies to each other in whatever way our people groups are fighting for full inclusion. And let me say, white people are not discriminated against for being white. I have never. My great-great-great-grandparents experienced discrimination for being Irish as they came into the United States because of a long history of treating immigrants badly and of something called nativism. But I myself have never once experienced harm for having the last name Sullivan and therefore being identifiable as Irish. I have never experienced harm. I have been looked over in a retail line for my friend who was Black because, the cashier was Black, and she didn't feel like dealing with a white person today. I've met people who had attitudes toward me, not often, but sometimes. Nevertheless, that's not the same I've never been kept from a job for being white. I've been kept from a job for being female. I've never been kept from a job for being white. I have experienced prejudice and discrimination as a lesbian and as a woman, but never for being white. And so that reverse discrimination stuff is not actually true. Really briefly, I know I promised to shut up a minute ago. Really briefly, it's not happening. There's not quotas to fill with a certain number of students of color in college. It's not happening in college admissions either, right? There is no reverse discrimination. Just because we make some number of room, some amount of room for the diversity of our actual population in our actual South Jersey region or in the United States does not mean that any white person is being, I may find out that my spot at Princeton went to somebody foreign born, or I may find out that the spot I wanted at Princeton went to somebody browner than me. That doesn't mean I had a right to that spot at Princeton, and nobody kept me from getting into college. So reverse discrimination is a lie, as is this noise against critical race theory. It is a spin, it is erroneous, it is not factual. And the history that race scholars are teaching in history and in law and in criminal justice studies and in sociology and in anthropology and in all of these spaces, this stuff we're doing, what we're teaching from the race literature is solidly grounded in fact. And we're just seeking to make the world a better place. Welcome to Social Stratification. I look forward to working with you over this summer term. And I will follow this with a few other videos and talk more about my part in this class and the part of the former professor who first set up this particular online Rowan Global class. So welcome and good to meet you.